Dear friends, dear sisters and brothers, warm welcome to this very special event in the Ecumenical Centre today. We will learn, we will hear, we will have time to discuss, and we have a very special guest with us to help us to do this. Bishop Emeritus Dr. Jonas Jonsson, also with your wife Birgitta Rubensson, a former staff of the World Council of Churches. You are here to present to us your study of the life and the legacy of another Swedish ecumenist, Nathan Söderblom. We are immensely grateful that you have given us this opportunity to reactivate and also to learn again from his significant life and work. So, Bishop and Professor, and if I may, in the house, dear Jonas, as you for many years also worked in this house, we have been looking forward to this day. And let me also welcome all of you, colleagues, but also former colleagues, guests from the house, but also from outside the house. This seminar is co-organized with the Church of Sweden, and we welcome also Reverend Dr. Anders Mogård from Church of Sweden. But we also have a nice audience, including students. Students from both the Bossi Ecumenical Institute and from the Institute for Orthodox Theology Higher Studies at Chambéry. let me say a few words about Jonas Jonsson. You were bishop. Now we call you Bishop Emeritus of Church of Sweden, but I've only get to know you as a bishop. That's my relationship to you. But you were not only a bishop, you were also a bishop representing the ecumenical movement and its ideas and its visions in so many of our ecumenical gatherings over the years. There is always something new to learn from listening to you, discussing with you, but also more and more to learn from the history you know about. Well, part of your history is related to this house. As associate professor, no, associate or deputy general secretary actually, of the Lutheran World Federation. But you also have an academic background as associate professor of missiology at the University of Uppsala. But you have also served the World Council of Churches in its governing bodies and functions. We had to check the archives, but you were the Assembly Program Committee moderator for the 8th Assembly in Harare in 1998. And we know, many of us, that you have been chairing the joint working group of the World Council of Churches with the Roman Catholic Church. But you have paid interest in our work, and you continue to do that, and we see your presence here today again as an inspiration for us, all of us, both the Lutheran World Federation, the WCC, and others working in the house. You have also given inspiration to many through your work as director of Stiftsgården Rättvik, where many young theologians and others got their ecumenical vision. So, as we today will learn about Söderblom, we will also learn about Söderblom's effect on the ecumenical movement in your church, but also worldwide. Before we hear more, we should hear some practical information from Klaus Grue, and you speak from there.
Things are working. Thank you. Yes, quite an exciting afternoon, and technology has developed since the days of the man in focus today, because you are being live streamed, broadcasted around the world right now. This session will be, and you can also watch it later on. We will also cover on our website, of course, the WCC website, where you can read more. Later on. The program, in short, is that the keynote speech, after the keynote speech by Bishop Jonsson, the General Secretary will respond to that, and after that we will have a coffee break for 20 minutes outside here. So we should be back here at 3:10 when Reverend Dr. Ximena Sun will share her knowledge on the topic of the day. And after that we will have a panel discussion with the three participants, and then invite the audience also to reflect and come into the discussion. And we will wrap everything up with music in the spirit of Nathan Söderblom. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. This bust of Nathan Söderblom is outside my office. So every morning and every afternoon I greet him. That has been a reminder of our roots, also as we as Scandinavians also have contributed something to this development and its movement. But it is particularly a reminder to me, as I've been able to read the book in Swedish, which we will hear more about, the English translation of it, Nathan Söderblom, Called to Serve, and reflected on his vision and his thinking about what we actually need to do. That we need to do something else. We have to change not only the church, but also the world. And this call to serve comes to me through him every day. But today we will also have an opportunity to go in depth, listening, learning, maybe also reflecting more about what is actually written there. It's a good text, it's a good reader. I hope if you're not read it, you will read it. But now we give the floor to Jonas, and let us hear more about this man, Nathan Söderblom, and his legacy.
It's great indeed to be back in this house where I've served for many years and learned more theology than anywhere else. This has been my university, and I'm grateful for that. Now I will try to take you back to times way back in history, the times of the steamers crossing the Atlantic, the trains in Europe being interconnected, and Geneva being very far away. But Uppsala being even further away, Uppsala in Sweden, where Nathan Söderblom lived his life. He was a young professor of the history of religions, and he was consecrated Archbishop of Uppsala on November 8th, 1914. Europe was being torn apart by the First World War. In no time, an unprecedented hatred had turned La Belle Époque of Europe into ruthless enmity, destruction, and death. He had shared the pre-war lightness of heart, the taste of modernity, and the confidence that religion, culture, science, and technology would bring a bright future to humanity. With commitment and inexhaustible energy, he had personified pre-war optimism and progress, enjoyed open borders, scholarly exchange, and the early signs of Christian cooperation and unity. But now his life took a new turn. The war and the iniquitous peace agreement that followed were to determine his ministry as Archbishop in ways he had not foreseen. He had lived in Germany. In fact, he was in Germany when the war broke out. And he had experienced at first hand the enthusiasm of national mobilization and initial expectations that the war would be a short and morally purifying affair. But battlefronts had frozen, and there was no peace in sight. Sweden was determined to remain neutral, and it was Söderblom's firm conviction that Sweden, in case it was spared, had a God-given obligation to promote peace with justice. He instantly set his ecumenical agenda to be followed through his 17 years as Archbishop. He belonged to Uppsala. As an undergraduate at the university, he had been the brilliant spokesman for the students. As a doctoral candidate, he had made himself a name as an intellectual, a public speaker, and a writer. After 7 years in Paris, 7 very important years for him, he had returned in 1901 as a celebrated professor and the most appreciated preacher in town. In a theological faculty, this was in 1901, in the theological faculty marked by isolation and conservatism, he became the modern theologian with wide horizons. 2 years in Leipzig brought his academic career to its peak, but he had long contemplated rather being a church leader. Restless and self-confident character who wanted a more public platform from which to speak peace and love to the world. What other position could compete with the medieval Archiepiscopal See of Uppsala? He purposely inflated its historical significance and put it on par not only with Canterbury, but also with Constantinople and Rome. At the age of 48, his dreams and ambitions came through. His election by the church and appointment by the government turned out as a providential paradox. It was only by the drawing of lots in one of the diocesan chapters that Söderblom scrambled onto the short list of 3 names forwarded to the government. No bishop and few among the clergy gave him their vote. Still, the government proposed him, and the king confirmed the appointment. Choosing him would possibly ease off a prevailing political polarization and at the same time help in renewing the aging church. As Söderblom was known not only for his modern theology, but also for sympathies with the labor movement, as well as royalism and support of the armed forces. He was not welcomed by his fellow bishops and would actually never be fully trusted by them. They found him unpredictable, too undogmatic, and often too radical on social matters, and they looked upon his ecumenical and international projects for unity and peace as his own personal enterprise. Soon he established himself, however, as the most charismatic, open-minded, and energetic Archbishop in the Church of Sweden since the 16th century Reformation. With his extrovert personality, he brought about a growing rapprochement between the church and culture, and the tension caused by left-wing socialism decreased. At a personal level, he held on to the fundamentals of his inherited evangelical tradition. Intellectually, he remained a genuine liberal theologian in the line of Ritschl, Harnack, and Sabatier, and he was highly committed to social justice. His opponents among conservatives, liberals, socialists, and free church leaders alike would look at him not only as theatrical and contradictory, and as compromising classical Christianity, but also as a kind of fake socialist using the church for advocacy and social reform. Though sympathetic with the labor movement, his social thinking was not shaped by Marxism, far from it, but rather by Christian social initiatives in Great Britain, France, and Germany in the 1890s. Fearing revolution and political populism, he pleaded for gradual social reform and an educated political leadership. Among the cultured elite, he was widely admired for his undogmatic view on religion. He received moral and financial support, not so much from the church as from the old landed aristocracy and wealthy industrialists. In spite of Söderblom's fast-growing popularity, till the end of his life, he was object of much disapproval. Neither his extraordinary relief work during and after the war, nor becoming a member of the Swedish Academy, or his recognition as one of the most respected personalities in Europe, silenced his critics. Only after the Universal Christian Conference on Life and Order, Life and Work in Stockholm in 1925, and even more so after the Nobel Prize in 1930 and his unexpected death in 1931, did objections give way to unanimous national and international praise. He then became an icon of goodwill and saintliness. His position in the modern Swedish church history corresponds to that of William Temple in England. Nathan Söderblom was a rich and very complex character, deeply spiritual, a mystic, and an activist at the same time. He was ascetic and extravagant, an actor with close friends among artists and authors, and himself a first-class musician and a master of rhetoric and communication. His brilliance matched an extraordinary strength of will and a demanding self-discipline, at times characterized as inhuman. He liked the metaphor of a racehorse and its rider. I quote him, "The good horse can achieve its highest capacity and its greatest speed only under the firm hand of the rider. So it is with the soul. Only under the firm hand and the strict bridle of God can the soul be encouraged to give its best." This is what he used to say. Considering his humble background as the son of a rural pastor, he moved with remarkable confidence and disarming humility and humor among all kinds of people, be they peasants, academics, statesmen, or royalty. His French was perfect, his German flawless, his English good enough to arouse admiration. To him, time seemed to have no limit. His 10 children, however, they paid a high price for him being totally captured by his vision and vocation. Söderblom lived at a time when world Christendom was thoroughly transformed by external and internal forces. Empires disintegrated, monarchies gave way to republics, German state churches became independent, Russian Orthodoxy faced severe persecution, and at the same time, Christianity expanded rapidly in other continents. The international missionary movement was at its peak in the years preceding the World War I. And American denominationalism became an ecclesiological novelty. Faith itself was severely challenged by science and secular ideologies, and not least by the loss of credibility as Christian nations fought that devastating war. In an exceptional way, the established churches in Sweden and in Britain were able to make their transition into modernity with structures comparatively intact. Uppsala and Canterbury therefore felt particular responsibility as agents for peace and unity. Already in 1908, Söderblom had established a personal relationship with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Randall Davidson, and it was only in close cooperation with a number of Anglican bishops that he was able to implement his vision. When he took leadership in the emerging ecumenical movement, he was well prepared. As a student, he had traveled in the United States in 1890 and met with the confident and cultured New England evangelicals who had a generous ecumenical agenda at the time. In his diary, he scribbled a prayer which would follow him. Lord, give me humility and wisdom to serve the great cause of the free unity of thy church. He had, as I mentioned, lived in France. He had visited Britain several times. He had taught in Germany. He was part of an extensive network of personal relations, including ecumenists like John R. Mott and Wilfrid Monod. His correspondence was already voluminous. Already in 1909, he was then a professor, he negotiated an agreement with the Church of England on intercommunion, and the following year, he published a major study on the modernism of the Catholic Church. And this defined his rejection of Roman Catholicism and its authoritarianism. In 1911, he spent some weeks in Rome, Athens, and Constantinople, where he first encountered the Eastern Orthodox Church, and gradually his ecumenical vision and vocation matured. Söderblom's academic field, and we should remember him as much as an academic person and as an archbishop. His academic field was the phenomenology of religion, which was a fairly new subject at the time. He was not a systematic theologian with a well-developed Christology or ecclesiology. Christian ethics and practical action took precedence over church dogmatics. The universal Spirit of God was of greater significance than the incarnational sacramentality, and the cross of reconciliation was more faith-inspiring to him than was the resurrection. The self-revelation of the living God, especially in prophetic religions, and a distinction between mysticism of infinity and mysticism of personality were fundamental to his theology. I'll come back to that. Having experienced firsthand how the war disrupted Christian culture and turned sisters and brothers into enemies, Söderblom felt compelled to act. And this is one of my key points. It's the First World War that creates the ecumenical movement. Immediately after his consecration in 1914, he sent an appeal for peace to church leaders all over the Western world with the hope that they would sign. The text flowed out of his troubled heart. I quote, "The war is causing untold distress. Christ's body, the church, suffers and mourns. Mankind in its need cries out, 'O Lord, how long?'" He reminded especially our Christian brethren of various nations that war cannot sunder the bond of internal union that Christ holds in us, and called upon God that he may destroy hate and enmity, and in mercy ordain peace for us. He secured the signatures of some leading Americans and a few bishops and theologians in the neutral countries. And the neutral countries in Europe, as you all know, were the Scandinavian, the Swedish, the Norwegian, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands and Switzerland. That were the 5 neutral countries. To his disappointment, every churchman in the belligerent nations refused to put their names to the document. The national war frenzy, to which preachers had made no small contribution from pulpit and rostrum, ruled out any church cooperation for peace. Others would have given up, but Söderblom from now on mobilized all his perseverance, diplomatic skill, and social competence to make Christians rebuild mutual confidence for common action. The worst obstacle was the enmity between France and Germany. Unless the Germans, without reservations, admitted their guilt for the war, the French would not meet with them face to face. Söderblom, however, was profoundly convinced that reconciliation with God and the unity of the Church were a condition for lasting peace in Europe. While fulfilling his episcopal duties in the large Uppsala diocese and in the Church of Sweden as a whole, he therefore pursued his attempts to make European Christians defy hostility and seek unity. But only when the war was over did he get the process started leading to the Life and Work Conference in Stockholm in 1925. It took him more than 10 years. Against all odds, he then succeeded in bringing sworn enemies together, even if it took them yet another year before they were ready to leave what they called La Schuldfrage behind. Söderblom may have overestimated his own influence and the political potential of the churches to make an impact on nations at war. But with the support of committed Anglicans like George Bell and William Temple, American ecumenists like Charles McFarland, and German Lutherans like Friedrich Sigmund Schulze, and Orthodox like Germanus of Thyatira, he was able to arrange his conference, and a few years later established the embryo of a permanent ecumenical council to speak on behalf of the churches. Stockholm in 1925 was a remarkable achievement for its time. It was one of the first major international convocations after the war, with more than 600 officially appointed delegates from churches and Christian organizations in Europe and the USA, and a few from Asia and the Middle East. And it's important to note that they had been officially appointed by their churches. Up till then, all ecumenical gatherings had been gatherings of individuals who were personally committed to the cause and paid for themselves, but now had official delegates for the first time. Swedish sponsors covered all the expenses. Royalty and celebrities lent luster to the event, and there was bright summer weather. So this became the event of the year in Scandinavia, and was also acknowledged all around the world. And the most noted personality of all the participants was no less than the Patriarch of Alexandria, Photius, 84 years old, who had just celebrated the 1600th anniversary of the Nicene Creed, and on his way back came to Sweden and became the central figure of this event. He died on his way back to Cairo, or Alexandria. This conference was reported all over the world, and suddenly Söderblom emerged as one of the most well-known international figures, invited to all kinds of events all around the place as much as he could could accept invitations, he did so. One famous event was when he preached at the opening of the what's called the Nationernas Förbund, the predecessor of United Nations, the League of Nations in 1926 here in Geneva, where he really scolded them in Saint Pierre. He really told them that they were on a way that would not work for the future. But there he was. And he continued working very much with these matters of war guilt. And the official report from the meeting in Stockholm was still disappointingly meager when addressing the peace issue. It was a conference that was called to promote peace. But these 600 delegates, they talked about just everything but peace. It was still such a hot issue that they avoided it by all means. The only thing that slipped into the report were these words: "We summon the churches to share with us our sense of horror of war and of its futility as a means of settling international disputes, and to pray and work for the fulfillment of the promise that under the scepter of the Prince of Peace, goodness and trust shall meet, righteousness and peace shall kiss each other." Therefore, the assembly was considered by many as a failure because they had expected a world-shaking result. But for Söderblom, it was sufficient that the conference had taken place at all. After his long years of persistent struggle, it was indeed a remarkable accomplishment that former enemies had met. They had talked, they had shared meals with each other, and they had worshipped together and even shared in the Holy Communion. For Söderblom, this conference, first of all, was a spiritual event. From the very beginning, he had defined ecumenism as the revival movement of the 20th century, not limited as the previous evangelical revival movements, not limited to proclaiming the salvation of individual souls, but calling for Christian unity and promoting peace with justice for the salvation of the world. At Stockholm, he spelled out two fundamental principles. First, inner life is essential. Institutions and organizations, laws and decrees, however good and necessary they are, will remain impotent, like empty shells and dead bodies, if they're not given the soul of life. They must be animated by the spirit of prayer and faith, love and hope. Only a change of hearts will bring peace and renewal to humanity. And second, love must conquer the world. Spirituality must not retreat to a cozy corner, but be mobilized, not for its own sake, but for the life of the world. This was what his conference represented: a call on God's life-giving spirit in the midst of war, greed, and self-assertive nationalism. For Söderblom, God was indeed a living God, continuously creating and renewing life and guiding world history towards its fulfillment. God reveals himself not only through the scriptures, but also in three forms of human experience: through the creative work of the genius, processes of history, and regeneration of individuals. He emphasized the role of extraordinary personalities, intellectuals, artists, heroes, and saints in creating history and thereby serving God's purposes. One can hardly understand Söderblom's own commitment without recognizing his humble conviction that the living God had chosen him as an instrument and a servant, and that he himself was making history. For him, a saint is he who reveals God's might. Saints, he said, are those who show clearly and plainly in their lives and deeds and in their very being that God lives. He did not refer to saints as particularly religious, ethical, or pious people. In his own provisional canon, saints often were contemporary men and women of struggle and action, gripped by the living God. Correspondingly, the great mystics in human history were not persons who denied themselves and withdrew from the world in timeless contemplation and union with the divine, but mystics of personality who confidently affirmed God's presence in their lives and served him in obedient self-sacrifice. His view of the institutional church was ambiguous. He rejected any idea that Jesus himself had founded the church and given instructions as to how it should be organized. At the same time, he attributed great significance to institutional history symbolized by the office of the bishop, ancient church buildings, and traditional rites. He did not talk much about the significance of baptism, and he distanced himself from incarnational sacramentality. He made a distinction between the church as a body and a soul, institution and spirit. The visible institution, the body, was molded by history and culture, and as a result it had taken on different forms. The individuality of churches and denominations should be respected, and he made a sharp distinction between unity and uniformity. Söderblom neither sought a united organization nor uniformity of ministry, liturgy, or even confession. True unity would only be found in diversity. One and the same invisible Spirit of God permeated every Christian community. They had the soul in common. Every Christian community had the soul in common. And this was one and the same through all ages and in every gathering of the faithful. Wherever there was authentic Christian devotion to be found, there was the life-giving Spirit of God. Though critical of hierarchical and therefore by definition oppressive institutional structures, Söderblom had no problem recognizing authentic spirituality and affirming a true faith among Catholic and Orthodox believers. His ecclesiology was challenged by people more inclined towards Roman Catholicism, but it served him well to enable cooperation between churches entrenched in overheated nationalism and self-esteem. By referring to their common soul, he was able to mobilize churches of many traditions for common action. By respecting the integrity of each church or denomination and differentiating between their body and soul, he managed to get even mutually hostile churches on board the ecumenical ship. The Holy See rejected his invitation, while the Orthodox, under mounting political pressure in Turkey, joined with the Protestants in order to gain some protection in a time of genocide on Armenian, Syrian, and Greek Christians. The Orthodox did, however, clearly disapprove of Söderblom's ecclesiology. Many Lutherans in Germany, as well as in the USA, also remained skeptical, determined to develop an international confessional body of their own. But Söderblom eventually convinced most of them to share in his wider movement for life and work. After the Great War, governments entered into a number of supranational agreements on mutual obligations. Such agreements implied a certain limitation of their sovereignty. Most churches were more hesitant. In spite of common roots, shared beliefs, and joint mission, they protected their individuality, rejected binding agreements, and any kind of super-ecclesiastical authority. And therefore, ecumenical structures remained weak and vulnerable. Söderblom's view of the church made negotiated cooperation possible, but it left the hard work of doctrinal agreement and ecclesiological convergence with others. That means faith and order. Many of his guiding perspectives and convictions remained relevant even today. There is still need to highlight the universality and Catholicity of the Church, and to reject racism, anti-Semitism, and ethnocentrism in favor of cultural and religious diversity. Söderblom's emphasis on spiritual ecumenism and his affirmation of Christian unity in the midst of cultural diversity are as relevant today as ever. Recognizing God's revelation and affirming that there is truth in all world religions, he took a more audacious public stand than most churches dare do even today. His promotion of binding supranational legislation and arbitration as a means of conflict resolution must remain a challenge also today for organized ecumenism. So Nathan Söderblom, with his all-embracing approach to religion and culture, humanities and art, and his overwhelmingly generous attitudes towards people of other faith, his combination with his unshakable commitment to the Christian cause made him prophetic. As he stood in the magnificent Uppsala Cathedral, facing his own future 105 years ago already, there were not many among the people present who could foresee the full significance of his service as Archbishop of the Church of Sweden. But as I said, when in 1930 he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, even his adversaries unanimously affirmed that he was a worthy laureate. And Söderblom still lives with us. New books are coming out, and I still think that we have much to learn from him, and we will learn more this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonas. This is really something to hear, but also to reflect on. And I've been given the task to share some further reflections, not only about him, but where are we today, also in the light of the impulses from him and others of that period. Well, we are reminded that last year we could celebrate 70 years of the WCC. Now we are reminded that there is a pre-existence also of the WCC, even in institutional forms, not only as visions. And I think one of the most significant legacies you point to, and which I think both is what has been realized in the WCC and is our vision, our hope today, is that we are able to work with these broad perspectives. Geographically, historically, also in terms of different church traditions and theological traditions, that we are able to bring them together and make them valid in its own right. His legacy inspired us to take also new initiatives to see and to realize the potential of religion as a contributor to peace and justice, and to offer new perspectives in the realm of religion itself. And as you said, and as we will be reminded also later, to nurture spirituality, which includes developing new hymns, new way of expressing our faith together. One of the strong gifts he had was apparently to not only discern the signs of the time, but to do something, and even to change, at least to try to change the times as they were. I think this is also carrying the vision of the WCC and its work today. Reading, understanding, but also acting in relation to the signs of the time. Reading the book, I was reminded that being involved in this institutionalized ecumenical movement as it is today still requires creative engagement, commitment, resilience, vision, but also professional skills, but also a certain ability to bring the different visions together for unity, for justice, and for peace. And I think the relations that he established is one of the great tasks we have today, to bring not only people together, but to bring them together to build relationships that really matters, that becomes relationship of trust, of openness, but also of faithfulness, but also of proper critical reflection and exchange. And as you told us, he was not afraid of being the critical voice to anybody, but at the same time building the relations to everybody. And I think this way of being mutually accountable to one another is what we have as really as a legacy, but also as our identity today. Another important dimension to his life and his contribution is to show that, well, we need institutional initiatives like the great meeting in Stockholm, but we need the full spectrum of human involvement. He was interested in the psychology of religion. He was interested in anything. But for me, and also hear it from some of his quotes, that when we today try to speak of an ecumenical movement of love and try to bring it into the theme of our next, the 11th assembly, with the theme, Christ's love moves the world to reconciliation and unity, we hear some echoes of his involvement, saying we need to move the hearts, but we need to move the hearts to move the world. Because it's not only to move the hearts, but it's to move the world. But it brings us back, in that sense, to some of our origins, but it brings us really back to the origin of our Christian faith, which he was not apparently that interested in. Maybe it was because the Christological debate had another format than what relevant for what he was aiming at. But that should not be an obstacle for us, in the sense that we also have to do Christology in our time, in our way. We cannot only do it as an historical exercise. So if we may learn something from him in that sense also, we should do more than he did. In that sense, we should not step back from difficult, but also creative theological exercises related to what does it mean to believe in Christ today in this world as it is. And this is also explored in many ways as we also in our time talk about a pilgrimage of justice and peace, being open for the others' contributions on the way, but do that with this spirituality of a shared religious commitment, even beyond the Christian communities. To speak about love is not to speak about a sentimental, emotional dimension of life and our faith. It is that as well. Emotions are not superficial. They are very deep. But love is also particularly to speak about what kind of actions. What kind of actions are we willing to do as persons and institutions and as movements together? And in this I hear him and hear you describing him as saying, don't be shy. Don't be shy. There are enormous potential in our faith and in our also organized faith together. In his openness, in his critical openness, he was very modern. I also even wonder if we sometimes could call him postmodern in some of his reflections. That's not so interesting to put labels on him, but to ask, what is it in his search that we continue, that we even may go beyond his answers? And one of them is, in my view, that we cannot leave this quest for unity on a sidetrack for some especially interested in a few questions in the ecumenical movement. This message of the power of love has much to contribute in all efforts we are doing, and to bring them together. Because we are facing not only signs of time, but also we are overwhelmed by the news, the information about our time, saying the powers of division, of polarization, are strong and stronger, and becoming stronger and stronger. The gaps between the rich and the poor, the privileged and the non-privileged, the nations that seek their own interest and not the world peace, the care for creation that we know that we have to have, is still not enough. We are ignoring the signs of our time in the reality of international politics. Even if many try, even if we try as an ecumenical movement, there is so much more to do. And again, it's an inspiring reading, but also listening, to say that we have to have longer perspectives. Not everything is achieved today, or this year, or next year, or in the 70 years even. But we might be on the right way. He needed many years to get the first meeting in Stockholm to happen. He saw some of the fruits, and then he left. But we need to see also what we do in these longer terms, in these longer perspectives, and say, if we don't do it, who will then do it? So that when we focus again on reconciliation and unity, it is not to say, oh, let's be nostalgic about the first visions of the ecumenical movement, but because it is needed. It's needed in the world, it's needed in the churches, it's needed among religions, and we as Christians may show that we have something to contribute because we believe in Christ, but also because actually we have learned something through our conversations, through our dialogues, through our working together, through our efforts, whether they were successful or not. And therefore, when we also in our pilgrimage focus on peace, it is not just because this has been our legacy, because it is a true Christian calling. It's a holy work. As he showed, it is the role of the church. We cannot be church without working for peace. And the stronger the powers are dividing us, the more we have to work for peace. and to show that the love we believe in matters and can make a difference. So, well, he was extraordinary, extremely extraordinary in many ways. And I think sometimes we are inspired by learning about extraordinary efforts. Our actions might be that we can't do that, but it can also be we can all use our gifts. As women, as men, as young and old, we all can contribute to this vision, to this work, to this movement, to show love. Everybody can express love and make it into action. This is the love that will bind us as churches together, that will bind us to the neighbor across the street or around the world. This is the love that will free us from distorted values and prejudice. This love that will see through the falsehood of racism and tribalism. This love will open us up to learn from criticism and self-criticism of our own complicity. And this is a love that will fire our dreams of freedom and peace. Love will unleash new visions, creative thinking, and fresh approaches, even to the steepest challenges. And what's going on again and again, year by year, is this week of prayer for Christian unity. And this week is the week of prayer in the Southern Hemisphere, reminding us again of prayer, of his understanding of that is real work. We can't do without praying together, but also respecting the many ways of praying, understanding that we all pray and can pray. But also, as a conclusion from my side, say, yes, we might be overwhelmed, and there are not many like him. Maybe we should be grateful that there are not so many like him. It might be quite challenging to be a general secretary with a lot of colleagues like him. It is still important to recognize that in any of us, in every one of us, there is this seed of love. There is a seed of opportunities, of possibilities, and we should be thankful that we see fruits. May God give fruits also of our work.
Thank you. First part of today's program has now come to an end, and it's time for a short coffee break. We're a little ahead of schedule, which is very good, I think. It will give us more time to interact and socialize a bit. The coffee is, I know, is on its way, so please feel free to stretch your legs and Sure. Change of program. Oh, fine. Yes, we are handing out the copies of the hymns that we are going to sing together later this afternoon, including one hymn by Bishop Jonas himself in the program. We will get back to that later this afternoon, and we will start after the break with reflections from Reverend Dr. Ximena Sun on today's ecumenism, and after that again we will have the panel discussion, and then we will open up for participation and questions. Anything else you wanted to add, Mikey? Yeah, you can perhaps play a little song. We can improvise a little music here while we're waiting for the coffee.
Good afternoon, everyone. While we wait for the coffee, we'll just introduce you to some of the songs. I want to start with the first one, which is on page 2, written by the person that we are focusing on today. And I'll just play through the melody for you. So we did this a few months ago in the Ecumenical Chapel, right here. So I don't know if you remember it then. So I'll just play through again and you can follow along. Those who are Swedish, you have the advantage of having the original text. Those who are not, you can follow the English, or if you want to attempt singing Swedish, you can do so too. Do it again later. Go to the next one, which also written by another Swede, and we fill us with compassion. Yes. This one is from Liberia. It sort of has a Negro spiritual component. So that goes like this. Was written by our keynote speaker and goes back to the Canberra Assembly, Archbishop. Yeah. Let me try that again. Archbishop said it's supposed to be a dancing, driving rhythm. So hopefully by the time we get to 4:45, we'll be ready to dance and drive it all the way with the coffee in our system. I think the coffee is now here.
The coffee is now here, so you're welcome to have coffee outside here, and we start again at 3:10 sharp. Sharp. Thank you.
refreshed by coffee or tea, we continue and we invite Reverend Dr. Ximena Sun, who is Professor of Ecumenical Theology at the Boston Ecumenical Institute, to share some of her reflections on this personality, but also on the themes related to this discussion today. Please, Ximena.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Klaus for the invitation to speak and to give an input on today's ecumenism. This is, of course, a very broad theme. So I focus my reflections on today's ecumenism also in relation to Nathan Söderblom. And I think it's quite appropriate. Nathan would have wanted us not just to look back, but to look at today's challenges, to look at today's opportunities. So I think it's very appropriate, and I hope that my remarks, my input, will be an opening for the panel discussion that we will then have amongst us. As the Bishop Emeritus told us, the world at the time of Nathan Söderblom was in a crisis. People felt the world was upside down. The order established was kind of shaky. New insights in sciences had troubled many of the traditional theologians. The industrialization had upset the socio-economic situation of many, many people. And political emancipation movements questioned the establishment. Finally, nationalism resulted in hostility and hatred between the nations. So this was a world upside down at the beginning of the last century. Now, how would we describe today's world? Maybe it's not a matter of order and disorder as it was at the time, but maybe a matter of the world is being scattered. It's fragmented. People are moving everywhere and anywhere. Ideas are moving, and there is no coherent whole. There is no order that brings everything together. So today the world is rather scattered. And the other element, which is actually similar to the beginning of the last century, is that there is a lot of hatred and fear, hostility and anger in the world. Now, Söderblom took the crisis seriously, and he saw a crisis in church and in society. And he engaged with the crisis by not anxiously holding on to old structures and old mindsets, but by envisioning new relationships in light of the gospel. So Söderblom felt the urgency to rethink the role of the church in society, nationally and internationally. So this is, in my view, one of the most important points of Söderblom's legacy. He opened the door for the church to envision a new way of being the church in the world, a new way of being the church in the world. Now I want to jump immediately to today. I see 5 points. And I just will name the 5 points and then elaborate on these 5 points. My first point is around mutual recognition. Mutual recognition is a topic that the Faith and Order movement has been dealing with in the last years and decades, but I think it goes beyond faith and order and is really mutual recognition is a topic for the whole ecumenical movement. My second point will be on world Christianity and religious plurality. My third point will be on church in the world. So how do we understand the world today? How do we understand society today? My fourth point is the planet. You will hear me speak about eco-theology as an important new perspective that has developed in recent decades. And my fifth and last point is the living God. And I was very glad that Bishop Emeritus clearly spoke about Söderblom's understanding of the living God and what that means for doing theology today. So let me get back to my first point, mutual recognition. Now, the ecumenical movement, which Söderblom pioneered, has made a difference to the self-understanding of many churches. These past 100 years have left their traces on many, many of our churches. And so today, most churches would affirm that ecumenical relations is an intrinsic part of being church. And that is different from 100 years ago. 100 years ago, there was a lot of estrangement. There was a lot of, well, also because people didn't know one another. Church leaders didn't know one another, but also there was a lack of knowledge about the other's tradition. And so Söderblom felt we need to bring together the people and we need to enhance our knowledge and relationships. So yes, the ecumenical movement has matured. Yes, this has happened. And so ecumenical relations are normal. In some sense, it's plausible today. But the question is, have we made significant steps forward in terms of mutual recognition? For me, this is still an open question. And even though for many of us, for all of us here in this room at least, and for many out there, ecumenical relations are the new normal, there is opposition. There continues to be opposition to the ecumenical movement from a variety of sources, but clearly, again and again, ecumenism is accused of weakening identities. So there's a new discourse about identity and self-understanding, and ecumenism needs to respond to that challenge. And the second challenge is that the ecumenical movement has been so successful that it seems normal to appreciate the other, but this almost leads to an indifference. We don't see the different tradition as distinct. We don't have in some sense, I think, again, knowledge and understanding of other traditions is fading away. So we need, again, to reinvigorate teaching about ecumenism also in terms of learning about one another. Now, the Faith and Order movement engages indifference on the one hand and all kinds of fundamentalisms on the other hand. And in the Faith and Order movement, we deal with the theological, ecclesiological, and ethical questions of today. So the search for visible unity continues, and I think the critical question is recognition. Now, my second point, world Christianity and religious plurality. When Nathan Söderblom connected different church leaders in England, in Constantinople, in different parts of the world, this remained largely a North Atlantic cooperation. And he was already going beyond many borders at the time. So that was pioneering. But from today's perspective, it was still limited. Today we speak of world Christianity because, as it said, the center of gravity of Christianity has moved south. And the global south is very boldly and joyfully being Christian in many diverse ways. So the diversity has increased exponentially, one could even say, has the diversity increased. Also, the numbers are shifting. What does it mean? It's very clear that in academic scholarship, there is huge interest in the local Christianities that are emerging, the contextual, vibrant expressions of Christian faith. How can we take this into account? The ecumenical movement, especially the World Council of Churches, I would say since 1968, actually since the Uppsala Assembly has, because it was the time of decolonization starting at the time, has broadened its scope. If we look at the pictures of general assemblies now, it looks considerably different from the Stockholm conference in 1925. But are we really able, in our theological thinking, to grasp the meaning? I think we are just starting to do that. And I want to remember that actually Söderblom himself was also curious. He was, if I remember correctly, involved in the Swedish mission in a sense that because he also wrote about other faiths, for example, about Buddhism, Ludwig Reichelt, one of the missionaries who was engaged in dialogue with Buddhism in Asia, was inspired by what Söderblom did. And so the question of interfaith relations was something that was, for Söderblom, on the one hand, natural, because as a historian of religion, he dealt with it, but he dealt with it mainly from the books. He didn't have the opportunities, apart from meeting Jewish people in Sweden, he didn't have the possibility to encounter people of other faiths personally and directly. And that's a huge difference for us today. We are privileged. I would say it's a privilege for us that we can meet with Muslims, with Buddhists, Hindus, people of different faiths. So that we see that religion is not just something kind of a coherent whole, but that we see the individual face of other religions. Now, with that immense diversity, first of all within Christianity, but also in the wider religious realm, this pluralization is a challenge in that the institutional dimension of religion is on the one hand decreasing. We see it in the Christian church. People live a Christian life, assert themselves as Christians, but sometimes have little connection to the church or move from one church to the other. And this leads to a deinstitutionalization and the question of what does it mean to be part of an ecclesial body for a Christian today? I think this is actually a question that the younger generation poses to us, the meaning of church for Christian life. My final point here is that I think Söderblom has had that generous and wide horizon, but he ultimately had a universalistic view and kind of inclusivism of other faiths, that he could not imagine the other as other. I think he didn't, to the extent that we see it today in the 21st century, reflect on otherness. He deeply reflected on diversity, but to see the other as deeply other and not just as a version of the same is something that he didn't do, and it actually comes back also in his view of God, in his own theology, where he puts that emphasis, as the bishop said, on the universal dimension of God and not so much on the particular revelation in Jesus Christ. I'm moving now to my third point, church in the world and society. What is different today is that we have a global civil society which is very active. We see it in demonstrations at the moment. For example, the climate crisis, climate change affecting many lives, and there is a civil society mobilizing around that on a global scale. That was unthinkable at Söderblom's time. He felt that it was the church who should be that global civil society. Now that we have a global civil society, the question for the church is how to connect with that. Do we see these movements, also the movement for gender justice, do we see that just as something out there, or are we as church able to connect with these global civil society movements that question the establishment, that question the powers that be? We see a rise of majority politics in many countries, whichever religious color it has, but there is often, not always, but often a religious undertone to majority politics. How do we as church relate to that? How do we take into account that in some countries we are indeed part of the majority, but in other parts we are part of the minority? How can we have a self-reflected approach to that? And in terms of freedom of religion or belief, it becomes very concrete today. But as I said before, it's not just in terms of freedom of religion or belief, but also in terms of other concerns like climate change, like gender justice, where being the church in the world means to connect with other movements. I'm moving to my fourth point, The planet. The global climate crisis and also the shrinking biodiversity is something that the Executive Committee of the World Council of Churches has addressed many times. And this roadmap that has been developed in order to have steps into local kind of communities engaging with the challenges is something that Söderblom did not see. It was not as acute at his time. So we need to move from the anthropocentric view. We need to see questions of social justice within the wider framework of eco-justice. Eco-justice not just being a loose green movement, but eco-justice as being justice for all of creation, as rethinking relationships in this world. And it's so important that the churches here press the leaders, the political leaders and economic leaders, that it's not just about technical solutions, because the ecological crisis is not just a technological crisis. So it needs a cultural shift, because we are embedded in a culture of exploitation and of domination, and that culture of exploitation and domination needs to be shifted around. It needs to be shifted in our mindset, so in our theological thinking, in our vision of the world, but it also needs to be shifted in our daily practices, in what we do or what we don't do. And it's very interesting, and I'm glad that the bishop in his book mentions Albert Schweitzer. Nathan Söderblom had close connections to Albert Schweitzer. Schweitzer was a theologian and doctor from Alsace, who strongly engaged with the question of the dignity of all living beings. He was for many years a missionary in Africa, and then he came back, and Söderblom actually invited Schweitzer to Sweden and gave him the opportunity for lectures, for organ concerts. And I think Schweitzer was quite pioneering in his vision of an integrated whole, that reverence for life. This is the famous phrase that Albert Schweitzer coined, reverence for life. And I hope that when the WCC moves to the Karlsruhe Assembly, which is very close to Alsace, where Schweitzer was at home, that we also recognize Schweitzer's legacy and his theological vision of the one planet. And finally, my fifth point, the living God. Nathan Söderblom was a man of deep spirituality. He was a man of prayer. He grew up in that 19th century revival movement. His father was a pastor. And so for him, spiritual life was natural. It was just so important. And that personal encounter with God shaped his own theology. And what is interesting, that he not only saw this as individualistic, in an individualistic way, but he recognized authentic spirituality in others. And so he found that resonance of spiritualities. And the question is then, how do we engage that personal spirituality with our theological knowledge? And that is so kind of unique about Söderblom, that he had that personal spirituality, but in terms of theology, he was very modern. He had a very wide horizon. And my question is, can we again connect spirituality and theology? Because I think this is so crucial. I see that in many places, spirituality kind of captures people's attention, and people really hunger for meeting God, for encountering God, for being strengthened and empowered by God. But what they think, and the reflection, or the kind of more cognitive side, that is shaped by other forces, and we don't have a theology that really takes into account the spiritual experiences of people. Now, at the end of my input, I would, of course, like to talk about Bosse and the Ecumenical Institute there, because what we do there is precisely to connect things. We have, during the winter semester, morning prayers where the students, and I'm glad that a good number of our students are here, where we share our spirituality during morning prayers, and where we kind of get to know the other's spirituality. And then during class time, we engage that theologically. We ask, what does that mean? What is the theological input in there? And that coming together of spirituality on the one hand and theology on the other is very important. Finally, I want to get back to my initial remark. Envision new ways of being the church in the world. Söderblom did not just gather random Christians and did not ask what is the Christian vocation in the world, but he wanted representatives of churches. And you mentioned it, the Stockholm conference was a conference of representatives of the churches. So people didn't just speak for themselves, but they were there as church. And I think this is one of the big questions today. How can we build church? And for our societies, the question is, how can we build community? Do we continue the disintegration and fragmentation that we see, or are we able to touch people's heart? And here I connect with what the General Secretary said, that love is something that moves the heart. But then these hearts that are moved, they need to come together in community. So for me, the future of the ecumenical movement needs to reflect on building communities locally and then connecting these communities on a national, regional, and global level to connect so that we reinvigorate this community life. And finally, almost like an afterword, I would like to announce a conference that we currently plan for next year. This conference is called Teaching Ecumenism in the Context of World Christianity. I can share some flyers later on. That was kind of initiated by the faculty in Bosse and is now shared by many colleagues in the WCC. We want to ask, what does it mean to teach ecumenism in the context of world Christianity? What does it mean to take seriously that the center of gravity has shifted and there are new configurations, new ways of being Christian? And I hope that some of you might be able to attend. It will take place next year in June in Bosse. 10th to 13th of June in Bosse. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you so much. We'll soon open up for the discussion and invite the panel up on the podium in a little while. But before that, let me just say a few words about the book here that Bishop Jonas has written. This is an English copy available. You can order it on Amazon very easily, available there. We can pass this one around and you can have a look at it. I haven't read all of it, but I have started reading it, and from a non-theological perspective, since I'm not a theologian, I find this a rather compelling account of a very interesting man, I would say. So I can really recommend it. Absolutely. I will now invite the panel of speakers to the podium so that we can start the panel discussion. And I think there are probably a lot of things to talk about and questions from you and the students here. And so we will open up rather quickly for the discussion, also invite the audience to participate in the discussion and ask questions. We will have microphones that we can pass around, whatever reflections and discussions you may have. But I think it would be appropriate perhaps to raise a couple of rather obvious questions, of course, that we could perhaps start elaborating a bit upon. And this is obviously a man who made a huge difference, no doubt about that. So how can we ensure that his spirit continues to permeate the ecumenical movement? How can that be assured? That is one question I think is would be interesting to hear you elaborate about. And the other one is, of course, today's main challenges for ecumenism in the spirit of Nathan Söderblom. And I would like to ask Bishop Jonas perhaps to start reflecting a bit upon that, and also invite you in to ask questions and reflect.
When I wrote this book on Söderblom, I started off without knowing too much about him. Of course, as a Swede, I'd heard and I read some, but still. And then I sort of recognized how many of the things that he was wrestling with are still the same, in one way, the same questions that we are wrestling with. So his spirit has been there throughout the ecumenical movement, and you sort of discover it all around when you start studying him. And I think that would be true for quite a few of these early ecumenical leaders, that they were personally so influential on what happened, that their questions and answers are still around without us noticing it very much. But Söderblom was very insistent that a movement, and he talked about the ecumenical movement as the revival movement of the 20th century. A movement must be given a structure, otherwise it will just be floating around. So already from the very start, his intention was to create a council that could speak on behalf of the churches. And the embryo of that council was really decided upon in Stockholm, in the Parliament building of Stockholm, after the Stockholm Conference in 1925. And he was insistent on that, because otherwise a movement would just sort of evaporate. But he did not give much instruction as to how it should be organized and so forth. But the very need of an ecumenical institution was clear from the very beginning. And that's, of course, also the way his spirit has been maintained throughout the years. Without that, without the World Council of Churches, I think it would have been all forgotten among all other idealists of his time. So let me just say that to begin with.
Any other comments on how we can how can we ensure that his spirit continues to permeate the ecumenical movement? The General Secretary?
By do it ourselves. I mean, I think the inspiration that he really can give is that we all should contribute to this involvement, and also involvement in structuring our visions and ideas into something that really can change something. Not only say that something is wrong, but really do it. In all
action
in all parts of the world, but also from different positions. Maybe you Swedes don't have this sense, but at least as a Norwegian, I know that we come from the very margin of the world. Historically, I mean, the last decades we have become the rich part of the world. But I think we should all think that there are places where we can do the same for the whole world.
Any comments from the audience? Any questions related to that? There's this here? No?
On the question of structures and institutions, one of the biographers of Söderblom, not Jonas, another one, compared Söderblom to Pope John the 23rd, saying that both had a freedom of thinking and the vision of the future, a free vision of the future, but at the same time, they were very keen on institutional questions. What would be your reaction to that kind of comparison, knowing that there is always a sound warning to biographers given by John Updike, saying that history buries the great majority of the people, but have the tendency to exaggerate the stature of those who remain standing. Thank you.
Who would like to comment on that?
Maybe I can start off from a slightly different angle. I was recently at a conference where the question was, religious leaders, are they protectors or prophets? That was in the context of an interreligious situation. Should the leader, I mean the bishop or the imam or the clergy of a community, be the protector or the prophet? And I think Söderblom understood this quite well, that in order to protect, he needs to be a prophet. And so I would say that it's not protecting this old thing or this old mindset, but in his case it was kind of the living gospel, the living God shared through the gospel. In order to do that, he needs to be prophetic. And in that sense, I think it's that sense of institutionalization on the one hand, protecting something to be handed over to the next generation, but not just in the sense of conservation, but in the sense of witness towards the future.
Jonas would like to add something?
He was not much of an organizer in the sense that he built institutions. He was a very clever organizer when it came to organizing a conference and things like that, and to mobilize people around him to do the job for him, even if he was involved with everything himself. But he had a very strong sense of both the spiritual heritage of the church centered on the cross. And I mentioned this, that he's very much a theologian of the cross, much more than of the resurrection, which can be a little bit surprising given his way of working. But he's very much aware of the suffering Christ at the very center of it all, and of authentic spirituality, or what he called Innerlichkeit, where he really felt, and he was very sensitive to this, he sort of recognized in people he met the authenticity of their spirituality. So that tradition, but on the other hand, he had one symbol that was very dear to him, and that was the bishop, and the bishop in the apostolic tradition, and the bishops of the church as the representatives of unity, not as representatives of different churches and traditions and dioceses, but as their primary vocation being representatives of the unity of the church. And therefore, he appeared to some people as a very high church kind of a character, but he was not, in fact, but he made very much out of the symbol of the bishop's office. So liturgy, spirituality on one hand, the institutionalized leadership of the church, if you like, on the other.
Okay, I think we have two questions here, one here and one here.
Thank you very much. I want to bring him to be a little bit human, because you said something that struck me, that he had 10 children, and you indicated that probably they felt his absence. So that's one thing I would like to hear more, what you really meant by that. But also to ask, were they of one mother or many mothers? And what would his wife or wives have said about his ministry and his achievement, given what you have said about the children? And the last one, generally speaking, when we tell our story of how we came to faith, many of us talk about our mothers and grandmothers. Can you also say something if there were any such figures in his life who really helped him to articulate his faith as a young person? The mother or grandmothers or any other woman figure in his life. Because I also understand that the gathering of 1925 did not have women. So my question is, as a woman, how do I feel that he is an example for me in the ecumenical movement?
That is quite a question. Some of the answers, or at least hints of answers, you will find in the biography. But let me say a couple of words about that. He was married to Anna. His wife's name was Anna. She came out of a kind of a, well, I shouldn't say much about her family, but she had a brother who was the leading opera singer and director of the Swedish Royal Opera at the time. And they came out of a very musical kind of a family, and so did he. His father was a pastor, a rural pastor up north, and a pastor was very much affected by the strong, rather legalistic revival movement at the time. And Söderblom had his own born-again experience at the age of about 23, 24, under the guidance of a woman. And with that experience, he went and joined with the Moody Conference in Northfield in the USA in 1890, and was part of that together with Mott and together with several others who would reappear in the ecumenical movement. And this was very formative for him. And he was singing, he loved Sankey songs, and he was singing and playing Sankey songs all his life. So he came out with that kind of background indicated. And then he married this Anna as a student already. And Anna was the most supportive kind of a wife he could ever have found. She was absolutely so supportive to him all the time, but she was also a very independent person. And it's a very interesting kind of relationship, and we can't take time here for that, but it's a very interesting thing that she did not quite share she admired him, but she did not share his faith enthusiasm. She was rather sort of distant. She actually never took communion in the cathedral. And she kept a certain distance. The 10 children, of course, they had a house staff and so forth. They attended with all the foreign guests coming to the Archbishop's house. The children were also around, and they were looked upon as a very happy family. In fact, they were not. There were some illnesses in the family, mental illness and so forth, and the children were revolting in various ways. They had 7 boys, and I would not say that fate was very, very kind to any of them. They really grew up with a number of problems. All the 3 daughters were married to bishops later. But so it's a large family, and you still now have people in the third and fourth generation around, some who have still been involved with the ecumenical movement. It's an interesting family, and you can put this in various ways. I would personally list Anna, the wife, was one of those who resisted vote for women. She thought that they could be representatives of men. And that has made all the people who have been studying this write her off. I think she was a woman of a high integrity and a very intellectual kind of a person. And she was the one who cared for the heritage of Söderblom. He died already in 1931, and she was a widow for 25 years. And she was really the caretaker of the heritage. And she meant a lot in Swedish church life. But I can't go into details, but your question is very interesting, because I think you can, there are lots of things to say about it.
Please. Thank you for the inspiring presentations that we have had the chance to listen this afternoon. Thank you to the 3 of you. Bishop, you mentioned in your presentation that Söderblom was very close to John Mott, and Edinburgh Conference was in 1910, and a few years later, or out of the literature, we know that 25 in Stockholm, he was very much inspired by the 1910 Edinburgh World Mission Conference. Could you say a few more words about this whole idea or about the closeness that he had towards the world missionary movement? You mentioned also the aspect of his focus on councils, on establishing a council in 1925. In 1921, we had the establishing of the International Missionary Council. So there must have been some relations, I guess. And the second question would be, in how far in our days this brings the two streams in the ecumenical movement of missionary movement and of faith and order questions, how far Söderblom could lead us to bring more close those two streams in the ecumenical movement. Thank you.
Now you excuse me for oversimplification, but he got to know Mott in 1890 when they were young students. And he was very much impressed by the kind of American way of being a Christian that Mott represented. But he was so kind and friendly with people, but still he was not very fond of Mott. He thought Mott was a person full of slogans and simplicities and military language, and he didn't like that kind of of course, they met a few times later, and Mott came to Uppsala a couple of times, and Söderblom kindly received him and so forth. But they were not very close, and when the World War started, he found Mott far too pro-Russian in the conflict. And Söderblom had his heart in Germany, but tried to be neutral in the war. So he did not like to cooperate with Mott in his efforts in Russia. So they sort of moved a little bit apart. Söderblom never attended Edinburgh. He knew many people who were there, but he didn't attend himself. And he never, or very rarely, makes any reference to Edinburgh in his own writings. His life and work movement is a separate movement, and it's practical Christianity, and the purpose is to bring peace and relief to Europe. And it's very clear on this. At the same time, he has himself, of course, he's part of his generation, and he has a lot of enthusiasm for world mission. And he makes much use of missionary connections and so forth. And he really turns on, because he's so into world religions, and he writes books on both Indian religion and Chinese religion. And he gets involved in 1917 in creating a university in China as kind of a thanksgiving from Sweden for having been saved from the war. And this is a major project of his, and the whole thing goes down the drain for various reasons. And it develops into a small college in China. But at that moment, he meets with this missionary Reichelt, the Christian mission to the Buddhists. And the two connect very well, theologically as well as personally. And Söderblom sees to it that the Reichelt's newly started mission to the Buddhists survives and gets a foundation to stand on. And Söderblom supports him wholeheartedly and makes also sure that he gets an honorary degree in Uppsala and all that. So that is a very particular missionary line that he supports. At the same time, he's the president of the Church of Sweden Mission, which operates in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania, and India, and China. And he is very supportive of it. But it's really the Reichelt line that he wants to support. Which is very controversial, I would say, not only in Scandinavia, but also in the rest of Europe. So there is no direct link between the missionary movement and the faith and order, and the life and work. But life and work and faith and order, there are lots of personal interconnections. And Söderblom faithfully goes to the first Faith and Order conference in Lausanne, and he takes the lead there as chairing one of the commissions. But he gets so disappointed with the whole thing, that he leaves before the conference is over. And he continues operating on his life and work line. And it's very clear, if you look at all these relations, that it's Söderblom who is really the one who is able to lay a foundation for life and work. So that becomes actually the dominant factor in the coming World Council of Churches. And you can read Söderblom into the decisions of the 1930s and up to the formation of the World Council very clearly, more clearly actually than, I would say, Faith and Order, and certainly than the Missionary Council, which comes in much later.
Thank you. I think we have Stephen, and then we have another question down there.
Yes, my name is Stephen Brown. I work with the WCC journal, the Ecumenical Review. I've got one anecdote and one question. The anecdote is that in 2016, when Pope Francis visited Lund for the joint commemoration of the Reformation, the following day there was a mass for Swedish Catholics in Malmö. And you mentioned hymns, and one of the hymns that was used there was Nathan Söderblom's translation of For All the Saints. Yes. Now, whether that was by accident or by design, I'm not sure, but an anecdote. My question is really to each of you. In your various dealings with Nathan Söderblom, what would you say is the most surprising thing that you found about the Archbishop?
Could I ask Simone to start?
Yes. Clearly, Nathan Söderblom is the man for life and work. He wanted to make a difference to the world. But I was amazed when I read about the connections with the Orthodox churches. For me, that was amazing. So he was not a faith and order person. That is clear, and you mentioned that. But he went to Constantinople. He met Metropolitan Germanos there very early. And then he kept the connection. He had a kind of an envoy, Hermann Neander, who was his connection to the Orthodox world. And then when it came to the planning of the Stockholm conference, there was a meeting here in 1920 in Geneva already, not here in this house, but in Geneva. And so the planning was in August, 1 week, where he gathered kind of representatives from churches. And that was largely a Protestant endeavor at the time. But Söderblom, kind of in secret, made sure that one day Metropolitan Germanos would appear with 2 other Orthodox and would speak about this endeavor of planning this conference in Stockholm. And so Metropolitan Germanos kind of gave his blessing to that endeavor, and it was because of the relationship that he built while he was in Constantinople. And then Metropolitan Germanos stayed in Geneva for the planning conference of the Faith and Order Lausanne meeting in 1927. And throughout, and at the time it was, maybe we can say it, even though we are in Switzerland, the Swiss churches didn't want the Orthodox at that point involved so much, and it was Söderblom who wanted them on at the table, and so that was an unusual move, and I didn't know about this before. I knew about his engagement for peace and everything, but I didn't know about this, and I was very glad to read about this.
It's almost a coup d'etat, actually, when he brings in, he hasn't informed anyone, because there was such resistance against Catholic or Orthodox presence. This was so much a Protestant meeting. Söderblom brought them in without having announced it beforehand into the plenary session. Germanos spoke and said that we are so happy that we are here and can be part of this whole thing. And it was a fait accompli. They could do nothing about that. And from there on, it went on. And Söderblom had lots of, a whole number of Orthodox personal friends in Russia, in Serbia, in Greece, in Egypt even, but especially Germanos. And they all together made this network. And of course, for him, it was a great thing when Photius came to Stockholm in 1925. He had met with him in London, where they had been celebrating the 1600th anniversary of the Nicene Creed. And so he convinced him to come to Stockholm, and he did so. And his presence at the Stockholm meeting is still remembered, because in that kind of situation, they had the closing service in the Uppsala Cathedral, And then Photius stood up and recited the Nicene Creed in Greek, and it was dead silence in the cathedral listening to this when the ancient church came sort of forth in that worship service. And then the patriarch moved up to the high altar to say the blessing for the whole community and send them off into the world. And this moment was, in Söderblom's own record, the peak of the Stockholm meeting, and it meant very much to him. And then, as I mentioned, on the way back from Stockholm, Photius died in Zurich.
I wish to continue your line. Thank you very much, my brother and companion in the ecumenical pilgrimage. About the relation of Söderblom with the Orthodox churches, I think there are two factors. One was the vicinity of Sweden with Russia and the close contact of Söderblom with scholars of the Theological School of Petrograd. The second was his discovery of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 1911, when he attended a World WSF conference in Istanbul, Constantinople, and he met the then rector of the Theological Faculty of Halki. And they came very close to each other. And they continued, to be very close. This was the first occasion, for Söderblom to see that something going on in Constantinople. And he said that he considered the highest spiritual authority of the Orthodox Church was the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Söderblom continued the relation with Constantinople, Ferrara, where is the headquarters of the Patriarchate, through a Swedish diplomat who was working in the Swedish embassy in Constantinople during the Ottoman Empire, of course. And Kolbodin was very close to Germanus. He was Bishop of Selevki at that time. And then, and I come to my point now, 100 years ago, these days, in 1919, the Patriarchate took the initiative to work on an encyclical on Christian unity. My conviction, although Mr. Tuft says that the initiative of Constantinople in 1920 was a separate initiative, and in fact we had three main centers from which the ecumenical movement emerged: Stockholm, London, and Constantinople, maybe in more modest way, but nevertheless it was there. And I am wondering whether the relationship, the discussions, the chatting between Kolmodin and Germanus, afterwards, the Archbishop of Thyatira, residing in Great Britain, and World Council President, maybe their discussion was influenced Constantinople, to take this initiative and have the encyclical. Encyclical which goes straight in the line of Söderblom. Forget the theological differences. They are not an impediment for the cooperation of the churches in the social and practical field. So, it was my contribution to the discussion.
If I may, I would affirm that this is the case. It has been well documented that Kolmodin in his conversations had a significant influence on the formulation of that encyclical. And it's very important. But just remind ourselves, 1919, there was no email, there were no SMSs, there were no phones even. So there is correspondence, and in Söderblom's archives in Uppsala, you may go there and read about, from his short period of 17 years as Archbishop, you can find about 60 1,000 letters kept with long theological and practical and other conversations with people all around the world. It's immense correspondence. And very often he would dictate 25 letters on a day to various parts of the world. And then he had his people like Colmodine in Constantinople. He had an ambassador in Cairo, had others who were relating to various churches and reporting on the development of churches in this troubled time. So it's a very different way of doing ecumenism.
Manoj Kurian, working with the WCC. Bishop Söderblom was also the president of the Uppsala Students' Union in his younger age. And so this also seems to be kind of a common thread you find among all the great ecumenical leaders, that they were very active as young people and part of students' movements. So I would like a question, this thought for both of you, all three of you. One is Bishop Jonas, if you can give a little bit more insight into his life. You already mentioned a bit about his going to to US, etc., which fired him as a young person. And to Professor Simon, what do you think it implies today? In the sense, especially, are we as young people, are the young people really who are movers and shakers? Are they connected to churches, or could there be more? And Olaf, what do you think of the youth engagement in your role as in leadership and linking up with, of course, with also our ecumenical movements education?
We all know that the student movement was very vital around the turn of the century, and he was involved with what was to become the SM, Wordsund Christian Federation, but much more with the YMCA, like so many others, which was in those days what we would call a conservative evangelical revival movement. It's pretty different from what it is today. But the student influence, of course, was great on all these people. You will hardly find a person in the early ecumenical movement who were not influenced by the various student movements, and so was he. But as I say, he distanced himself to some extent from Mott. They were rather different personalities and with different set goals also. But he was part of the whole thing and inspired by the whole mood and the optimism which really characterized the time. Before the First World War, everything seemed to be possible. And the evangelization of the world in one generation, in our generation, that kind of thing, they could make as kind of a vitalizing motto before the First World War. But then the whole thing changed. So, of course, he was part of that also.
Thank you for raising that question. I think the situation has dramatically changed in these 100 years. Students are still engaged. I mean, as we see, there are social movements for different causes, but students are more engaged, kind of issue-based. For this climate issue or for that question of justice, it's no longer kind of the student Christian movement as such. And the question is, can the church and can the WCC, can we connect with these students who have a cause to fight for, to be engaged for? Can we connect with them? And I think that, our communications department is very active to kind of connect in digital ways with younger people, but I think the future will be that we combine what we say online and offline meetings. I think still we need personal encounters. I mean, in Bosse is the prime place for doing it. We need these personal encounters, because if you don't meet face to face, if you don't share a meal together, how can you then just have a conversation over Skype? So, and I think in terms of methodologies for the future work, we need to be more intentional in combining online and offline meetings, and for young people, that's just natural.
We have a question here.
Thank you. Is this? Can you hear me?
Okay. Manoj asked the question to all of us about the youth engagement in the ecumenical movement, also in the ecumenical movement's institutions, as I see it. You cannot turn the history back, but I think without a way of engaging youth as persons, I mean, not only as friends on Facebook, but a real personal encounter and involvement with some of the movements among them, the ecumenical movement will not continue. I mean, that's a biological fact, but I think it's also a matter of spirituality, and it's a matter of refreshing. Sometimes we will see that young people will bring us back to what we might call even more conservative positions. They are not always liberal and radical in the way we might think. On the other hand, I think it is, and how can I speak, I mean, as getting into the older generations, even if we don't see ourselves at that, that without investing, I would say, time and I would say strategic time with the next generations, it will not continue. But we should not think that there is no opportunities. I think the WCC offers a lot of opportunities, and we invest. I mean, our biggest investment in a way in the program is in BOSE, in formation of the next generation. And I think we should actually do more and try to bring more people from more parts of the world to BOSE. I think that is one of our challenges.
Thank you. It's okay. Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you, Professor Simon, especially for reminding us on this personal dimension of ecumenical dialogue. Okay, okay. Thank you, John. I was listening to your words and also to other participants as well. And we heard something about the relationship of Söderblom with Orthodox.
Hold it a little closer.
Okay, okay. I remember from History of Ecumenical Movement in Volume 1, Rose wrote that meeting in Constantinople was very formative and important for Söderblom. He met there. She mentioned Archimandrite Scriban of Romania and Bishop Velimirovic from Serbia as well, and Metropolitan Germanos. But Bishop Jonas mentioned one interesting term for me. It was rapprochement. And as I know, in this period, the beginning of 20th century, it was one of key terms in theological discussion between Orthodox and Anglicans. So I'm interested, what was the influence of Archbishop Randall Davidson and Bishop George Bell? You mentioned two of these names, Anglicans. What was the influence of Anglican theologians to formation and shaping of ecumenical vision of Nathan Söderblom? Thank you.
Söderblom was a man of action. Söderblom was a man of action. He took the opportunity when it was given to him. And there was an initiative from England in 1908 to approach Sweden. I shouldn't go into the old history, but the Church of Sweden and the Church of England had so many similarities that they felt that we should really connect. But in those days, both churches were established state churches. And this was a very formal kind of a thing. It was not just like church leaders meeting today. It was surrounded with all kinds of formality with foreign departments involved and also foreign relations to Russia and other countries. And so it's a rather complex kind of thing. Söderblom got this meeting together in Uppsala, and they agreed on Eucharistic hospitality, we would say today, between the two churches. And then came the war, so it was this was confirmed by the Lambeth Conference only in 1921, but it happened already then. And Söderblom had built up very close personal relations with a number of British bishops, and he made maximum use of them before and correspondence-wise during the war. He didn't travel during the war, he maintained a very strict neutrality in the war between France and Germany and England. But he had a lot of, well, he had his friends everywhere, and he was, in heart, he was a Frenchman. His French was, it was beautiful, and French was the best language, the finest language in the world. But he also was very fond of German with their culture and philosophy and all the rest of it. But he fell in love literally with England, and especially with the high church movement in England, and with the connections also. There was much discussion at the time in England between those who went Catholic and those who wanted a wider ecumenical relation. So he made use of this, and given then that the war came and that the churches were destroyed in Europe so much, it was only the church actually in Sweden and in the neutral countries, but particularly in Sweden with this huge national church and the Church of England that were structurally intact, and felt, both of them, that they had been given a particular responsibility for furthering the cause of peace in Europe. And therefore, cooperation developed over the years, and Söderblom and Davidson wasn't that easy to handle and to relate to, but they went along pretty well. And England and Sweden came to play a role in the early ecumenical movement, which I think still needs to be recognized. And it's partly for very practical reasons. So we could go much further into detail here, but I would say that writing the early ecumenical history cannot do that without giving a very key role to the Church of Sweden and to the Church of England.
May I add one comment and one question to this, actually to a question Stephen asked, which I didn't answer. What surprised me most about Söderblom, and I think it is that he, I mean, if we were looking at him from a kind of perspective of today, he was a quite radical, he was very cultural, he was quite in opposition to traditional theology, at least in his country and in his Lutheran context. I would guess also in relationship to Orthodox and Catholics and Anglicans. But still he became such a high church profile, using the office as the platform. Wouldn't we see him as a contradiction in term today?
But he was an incredibly including personality. He really was able to sort of encompass all. And he was an extremely generous person. People were very angry with him, and there was lots of opposition at a distance. But people who met him personally were completely disarmed by his charm and his intelligence and his generosity. And people spoke exceedingly well of him when they had met him personally. But at a distance, they could be very negative and critical. And he really played his charm as much as ever could. He was socially extremely gifted, obviously. And also with his linguistic ability that I talked of, because there were very few people in those days who commanded languages the way he did. He also translated from Italian and Latin and other languages. And then his music, of course, he was just extraordinary when it came to music. But to answer that question, what surprised me? Many things have surprised me when I've been working with Söderblom. But I think what really surprised me is his perseverance and his strong-willed ambition to sort of reach what he had dreamt of. He was actually a rather frail person. He was close to dying several times along the road. He was not a healthy and strong and sporty kind of character. He had profound health problems, and at least in 1908, I think he was very close from passing away. And he suffered from heart disease and other things, and from depressions all his life. And it wasn't easy for him to this. He was not the kind of man on the platform, but he disciplined himself. He was so strong-willed. He controlled himself, and he got all these things done. But he lived only till he was 65, and then his health didn't last any longer. But this is one of the things that surprised me, that he was so strong in his weakness.
Any further reflections on that? I think we have a question here from this gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Abhishek John. I'm from the Ecumenical Institute at Bosse. I had a question on activism, mysticism, and ecumenism, the interrelatedness of these. Nathan Söderblom's ecumenical engagement was focused on activism, socially, politically, and yet, as you mentioned, mysticism also had a concrete place in his life. So my question is, what place, if any at all, does mysticism have in today's ecumenical movement, which at present seems to be doing very good on activism? Thank you.
That's a good question, as we hear from the reactions. I think there are different ways of responding to it. One is to say, no, it's no obvious connection. I think there is. And I think without dimensions of mysticism in our spiritual life, but also in, I would say, in communities that are supporting the one ecumenical movement, there are very strong dimensions of mysticism and spirituality which you could relate to that kind of word. And I would say without them, we would not be able to do our work. I have people who tell me personally that we are communities who pray for you. And I think I could not be General Secretary without knowing that.
Answers your question?
Do you think there's a place in the interfaith relations also, which is obviously a part of the ecumenical movement?
Definitely, and I think we have not seen what that will mean for the interfaith relations in our time and in the future. I'm just reading a book about religious plurality, which will be published next month, but it's not by me, but by a friend of mine. And his thesis is that it is by getting to know one another's practices of faith that the huge potential for interfaith dialogue is. So in a way, it's back to Reichelt and Söderblom.
Any further reflections on that particular topic? We want more tough questions, right? Here we have one.
Thank you. My name is Reverend Canon Luno. I want to ask two questions. One, I read that Nathan Söderblom received a Nobel Peace Award. I'm curious. I want to know what necessitated that, the reason behind the award, and secondly, he died before the formation of the World Council of Churches. He died in 1931. So he died before the formation. I want to know if there are principles or Christian ideologies which he promoted, which is still relevant to the modern ecumenical movement, particularly World Council of Churches. And then being the fathers and the pillars of the modern ecumenical, one of the pillars of the modern ecumenical, whose thoughts and ideologies are purely independent. Because today in the world, if you are not thinking and reasoning in the direction where the world is going, you are termed outcast or one thing or the other. How can we learn to be independent in thinking, even in the world, amidst the challenges of the world today? Thank you. Microphone.
Who would like to respond to that? Can we ask Simone to respond to that?
Well, okay. I think for me, clearly the biggest legacy until today is the commitment to peace. So when Söderblom was in Leipzig in 1914 and the First World War broke out, that was kind of a very deep experience on him and made him to work for peace and to overcome nationalism. So he had kind of lived in France, he had close connections to England, he had lived in Germany, and that commitment to transcend the borders and boundaries of nation and to bring people together and to work for peace is very clear legacy. It is kind of a pity, and you mentioned it clearly, that at the Stockholm conference, the appeal for peace was not as strong as it could have been, but still Söderblom continued to say that violence is no option. We need to bring people together to sit around the table. And for me, that's the Söderblom legacy, the strong commitment for peace and for non-violence.
Any further comments?
Yeah, there are many dimensions to this, what is relevant even today. I think it's very relevant that you should, as Christians, be able to cooperate for the good of humanity and the good of the world, even if you differ on matters of faith and dogmatics and church structure, what have you. And his point was that you should always be able to express love by practical action, regardless of the differences between you, and you should respect the differences, but you should still be able to cooperate. And that was a sort of foundation of the life and work, why Faith Norda took upon itself to try to sort out those differences and see if we could unite the churches. And that's a different line. But he was very clear on this one. And the other one that I think we still need to remind ourselves of, that is how decisive it was for him that God is a living God. We rarely dare think that in practical life. For him, it was such a strong sort of conversion experience in his early 20s, when he sort of realized that God and what we believe is not something that happened sometime. We don't believe in something that happened way back in history. It happens now. God is with us now and acting and revealing himself in various ways in this world right now. And we should see this, open our eyes, interpret this, and be able to play with this. So when we got into the whole mission debate of the World Council in the 50s already with the Missio Dei, to participate in God's mission in this world, that's a revival of the Söderblom thought, that God is living with us and acting today, and God wills something with this world. And therefore, we as Christians should go with that God stream and participate the Missio Dei. And Söderblom really, at a very early stage, made these, and still, remember, Europe was full of established, aging state churches, pretty, they were not very mobile, to put it that way. They were there as national churches. They had hardly any relations between themselves. And they lived in their national surroundings, And here comes this prophet and says, God is a living God, and God is making use even of these mossy old churches. And so it was quite a radical message of movement that he threw into this. And the miraculous thing is that he didn't only get a number of individuals behind him, but he got whole churches behind him, including a church like the Church of Sweden, which I think was a miracle of God that he could make that kind of a church move.
Thank you. I think this is a very, very important line in our conversation and reflecting on what is actually his legacy that actually make a difference also today. I touched it a little bit in my introduction, but I believe that we will see that it is it's a need for unity, but unity that is not behind us historically, but in front of us, that will come to us and we will come to it, and that we can contribute to it, even if we have not solved all the challenges among us. This was in a way the message also when Pope Francis visited us last year, that we believe that we can do a lot together. And that is not only to say it is non-theological factors, it is a way to believe in God's presence in today's world, in what we do. So I think the unity that Nathan Söderblom was working for as a practical unity was not a non-theological unity, but it is what God will bring us to through our movement together.
Thank you. I think we have one last question, one brief question before we will start wrapping things up. Please.
Okay, thank you. I'm Emmanuel Faremin from Osobose. My question, I was excited to hear that he was a man of prayer. And at the age of 23, he was born again. Now, today when we talk about spirituality, I want to experience spirituality, we talk about These, very popular when it comes to spirituality. Söderblom was a man of prayer, a spiritual man. My question is, what is the Swedish church doing to uphold that spirituality, especially among the young people? Young people.
Söderblom has left marks on Swedish social, cultural, but also liturgical life. And the thing that we can most easily see is that he renewed the whole way we commemorate the Passion and celebrate the Holy Week, where he actually borrowed the model from Rome. He was in Rome and he went from church to church and saw how they had commemorated Christ's suffering, and he brought it back to Sweden, and that has really left its marks on Swedish spirituality over the years. And I mention this first because we're going to sing this song, The Vessel Burst and Fragment Oil is Pouring. When Söderblom almost, in 1928, he was very frail, and he wrote a big book, a meditation book on the history of Christ's suffering. And then he had a hymn at the end of each week that he had in this book. And then he found this first verse, the vessel burst and fragrant oil is pouring. Its scent is reaching to the ends of earth. Your soul of heavenly perfume now surrounded is blessed and lifted up from dust and dirt. This is, of course, the Mary Magdalene and that story. And then it comes, his own verse that he wrote himself. May vessels burst with costly perfume streaming. Don't hesitate. Prepare your soul for feast. What joyous splendor. May your love be giving its greatest gift to him, your honored guest. You have all his sort of enthusiasm, his spiritual overflowing joy and gratitude, and this verse summarizes his life. He was such an outgoing person, such a self-sacrificing person. He had no limits, really. He gave literally his life to others and for others, and that's sort of summarized in this little verse that we're going to sing. And this kind of a thing, you can't measure things. I'm not going to even try to do statistics on that. But Söderblom's personal spirituality and personal commitment, personal mission, actually the Church of Sweden before Söderblom was a very closed and isolated and conservative Lutheran church. The Church of Sweden has, after Söderblom, maintained the heritage of ecumenical commitment, of openness, of curiosity, of borrowing in from all other churches. We have lots of things that we do regularly without thinking of it, that we have got through the ecumenical movement into the church, not least music, but also many other things. So the church today would be defined by many as far too open, but it's a church that sort of tries to live this. And may vessels burst with costly perfume streaming. And that kind of, there is a culture of spirituality which he had added to, which is very significant for the whole church, including young people in Sweden today. And I'm glad that I dare say that.
Thank you. I think we have one more comment here, or question from our representative from the Church of Sweden.
Yeah, I had a question about the former topic about the legacy today from the view of Söderblom. That today the society is more and more fragmented, but we also see a lot of movements. For example, for the environment and Greta Thunberg and so on, different types of movements that I think Söderblom would have say, look, here we can see the living God act through the different movements. But what would the church role be in this? When we see how God, the living God, acts through different movements, what is the church role? Can perhaps Simon have some comment on that?
Please.
Yes. Yes. I think especially in terms of the climate change challenge, and Greta is, I mean, she's a great activist. But one of the problems in today's world is, I would almost say that we have an almost apocalyptic eschatology. Because do we still have a future on this planet? I mean, this is what young people ask. And some young people go into activism and say, we have to stop it, we have to limit the increase of temperature on this planet, and they rush kind of to the streets. But others are rather hopeless, or I mean, they don't see the future for this planet. So they say, okay, I live now and I can't do anything. If I do as an individual something, it doesn't have the effect. So I think people realize that it is about going to the street and putting pressure on the decision makers, but it is also about what is there a future for this planet? How do we envisage this future? And I think in Christian theology, we have kind of not talked about eschatology for a long time. We have not talked about which vision do we have in terms of kind of theological vision. And that's a big question that maybe we should start again to talk about this, so that we turn the fear and hopelessness into hope, not just into activism, but into hope. Yeah, so that's one response.
Any other reflections, General Secretary?
We had actually a seminar in Tao Fung Shan in Hong Kong last month, which was the institution or the center established by Reichelt for the dialogue between the religions about food and the future of this earth. How do we share the resources? How there will be a future of possibilities or not? But I think it was, at least my observation there, that there is a huge will to connect the spirituality in a way from dialogue into something that is not only activism, but something that is changing our will to be together. And that was really a sign of hope for me, that we are not having spirituality here and we have activism there and we have maybe politics here and theologians there, but there is a way to bring this together that can make a difference. And I think that is really also in line with the legacy of Söderblom.
Thank you. We are now moving ahead with the program. Thank you so much, the panel, for reflecting on this interesting topic. Thank you to the audience for your comments and questions and reflections. We will now continue with music, and I will ask Mikey to say some introductory words before we start playing and singing.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes, and I've chosen 4 songs, 4 hymns. The first, of course, is written by the person that we've been speaking about, and it sort of sets the framework. The second continues along the theme in terms of looking ahead to the future and asking and praying for renewal, and ending on the theme of hope that Simone ended with. And then the third sort of looks back and recognizes how far we've come, giving God thanks for that. And then the fourth also celebrates our presenter today and goes back to the Canberra Assembly, I think, and Bishop Johnson will speak. Johnson will speak a little bit on that one. All right.
Okay, and we will, as an introduction to each piece here, there's a Bible word which some young people here will help us read, and I will ask Salome to read the first one. I'll give you a mic.
6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume.
I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect.
First Samuel chapter 7, verse 12. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Jeshanah, and named it Ebenezer, for he said, "Thus far the Lord has helped us."
The General Secretary thought that we should also sing a song that I myself had written. And this was one of almost a theme song for the assembly in Canberra in 1991, where the theme of the assembly was "Come Holy Spirit, renew all creation." And this song was written and was sung pretty much at that assembly, and it has been sung since. But it has also been sung in our drama meetings at Retic, which Carlos referred to. So let us try to sing this, but I think we have to stand. If we get any of the candles.
The Archbishop said it goes very quickly. He's driving, so it will move along, and hopefully you catch the notes along the way.
that's a good way to end. There is freedom, and there is freedom to live in peace, but we will give you a word of thanks, Jonas. Thank you for everything you have written, but also everything you have spoken. I think the combination has inspired us to continue to read. Thank you for this opportunity to really have a good conversation about not only Nathan Söderblom, but our life today as WCC, as ecumenical movement, but also about the future. Thank you to everybody who contributed, and there are some signs of appreciation to be given. Let us go in peace.
And then it's photo time. We would invite all the BOSSI students and Chambéry students to join with the General Secretary and Bishop Jonas, if it's possible. And then we have a second one with only the BOSSI students.